All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and for the very important work that Hacks and Hackers are doing in holding this conference. And thank you for attending and bringing your expertise and experience to bear on this problem. It's a privilege for me to kick off the morning session of the State Actor Day of this conference. And to do that, I'm going to give you an overview of how the Department of Justice views the problem of misinformation. I'm going to put it in the context of some other related national security threats. And then finally, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're trying to address it. Now, as Renee already referred to the Internet Research Agency, you probably know it's one of the entities that was recently indicted earlier this year for federal crimes in connection with an effort to interfere with the last presidential election. The defendants, according to the indictment, allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States, with the stated goal of spreading distrust towards the candidates and the political system in general. Now, according to the indictment, the IRA was a very structured organization. It had a management group, and it was arranged in departments. One of those departments, or the Translator Project, was designed specifically to focus on the U.S. population, and it had more than 80 employees by July 2016. They posed as politically and socially active Americans, advocating for and against particular political candidates. They established social media pages and groups to communicate with unwitting Americans, and they also purchased political advertisements on social media. Now, one of the so-called trolls who worked for the IRA, but in a different department focused on domestic Russian propaganda, recently spoke to the Washington Post. And he described his experience working for the IRA as a place where you have to write that white is black and black is white. Hundreds of people were all writing absolute untruths. But as the indictment alleges, what made the defendants' conduct illegal in the United States was not the substance of their message or the so-called accuracy of their opinions. It was their conspiracy to defraud, among other ways, by lying about who the messenger was. They were not Americans expressing their own viewpoints. They were Russians on the payroll of a foreign company. Now, this problem of covert foreign influence is not a new one. In 1938, a congressional committee found that the Nazi government had established an extensive underground propaganda apparatus inside the United States using American firms and citizens. The response was to recommend a law that would, and I'm quoting the committee now, throw those activities under the spotlight of pitiless publicity. The result of that congressional investigation is what we call the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a statute that, what we call a disclosure statute, that notably does not prohibit speech. Rather, FARA requires agents of foreign principals who engage in political activities within the United States to file periodic public disclosures with the Department of Justice. The purpose of the act is to ensure that the American public and policymakers know the source of the information that's provided at the behest of a foreign principal, which enhances our ability to evaluate the information. So transparency, not prohibition, has been the government's response to misinformation from abroad. In the 1980s, the executive branch established an interagency committee known as the Active Measures Working Group to counter Soviet disinformation from that era. It did so by exposing forgeries and other propaganda, such as fake stories that the Pentagon developed the AIDS virus as part of a biological weapons program. Now, today we confront misinformation as only one component of a broader malign foreign influence effort. And am I right in guessing this is okay? So recently, the Department of Justice put out a Cyber Digital Task Force report. The first chapter of that deals entirely with foreign malign influence operations. And as the report shows, the type of operations we're discussing today are only one component of what a foreign government might try to do. They might also try to break into computer networks, write election systems or campaigns. They might try to dox to try to hurt particular candidates. They might unwittingly support unwitting Americans, try to organize rallies, or they might more transparently use state media to try to influence the American public. You're obviously not going to be able to read the text on the screen, but you can see that chart in our report if you're interested. What it describes is how we, the department, and other parts of the federal government try to counteract each of those different efforts. Our responses to foreign influence efforts need to be multifaceted, just like the techniques that our adversaries are using. And they range from criminal investigations and prosecutions to sanctions and expulsions and other efforts to raise the costs on the activity. So, This graphic, which you also won't be able to read, specifically outlines what our strategy for countering foreign influence, so content-based operations specifically. And along the top, you'll see the different stages of a malign foreign influence campaign that our adversaries might use. That's in red. And then in blue below, you'll see the various ways we think we can counter those efforts. And again, this is online, so if you are interested in reading it, don't hurt your eyes now. So, one aspect of this strategy worth highlighting is that the content of a foreign influence campaign may be true or false. I like what Renee said, which is that we shouldn't approach this problem as a problem about truth and fiction. At least that's the government's perspective. Whether the message is accurate or not may not be the point, because doxing a candidate or a corporation for political reasons might not involve misinformation, but it may nonetheless violate our laws, threaten our values, and so forth, by compromising privacy, retaliating against, and therefore chilling free speech. So, covert foreign influence efforts can take many forms, but recently we've seen increased efforts to influence Americans through social media. So to counter those efforts, a key component of our approach at the Justice Department is sharing information with social media and other internet service providers, which we do through the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force. It's those providers who bear responsibility for safeguarding the security and privacy and proper use of their platforms. But by sharing information with them about who their users actually are, who stands behind them, who the account holders actually are, we can assist their own voluntary initiatives to track foreign influence activity and enforce their terms of service. Now, as the task force report also recognizes, there may be occasions where it's appropriate for the government itself to expose and attribute foreign influence operations as a means of rendering them less effective. But there are often compelling and countervailing considerations. First, as a general rule, the Justice Department does not comment on, confirm, or deny pending investigations. And that's for a couple reasons. One, to protect the investigation itself, and two, to protect the rights of any accused that there may be if the investigation results in charges. Second, we're constrained to protect the classified sources and methods that may inform our judgment about what a foreign government is doing. And third, and absolutely most important of all, we must never act in a way that confers an advantage or disadvantage on any political or social group, organization, or individual. And we must strive to avoid even the appearance of partiality. So that could constrain the timing and nature of any disclosure we might make. So all this is to say, and as the department's policy on the disclosure of foreign influence operations recognizes, we, the government, might not be the best messenger to confront a particular piece of misinformation. That's why this conference is so important. What we in the government call the private sector, but which includes a lot of people in public spaces like you, have a critical role, and I would say larger than the federal government's, in countering covert foreign influence efforts, particularly misinformation, and ensuring that our democracy rests on the active engagement of an informed public. The former Russian troll I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks said that he didn't think the work he was doing with respect to domestic Russian propaganda was worth the effort. He called it pointless, said it wouldn't impact them. But in America, he said, he thought that kind of trickery might have an impact. The reason being that we live in a society in which it's, quote, accepted or expected to answer for your words. So my challenge to us during this conference, if you'll let me make one, is that we find ways to ensure that we all continue to answer for our words, so that the trust we enjoy as an aspect of a free democracy continues to thrive. Thanks.